So, welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lee Petty. Lee Petty is an art director and project lead, currently at Double Fine Productions. He has worked in the video games industry for more than 20 years now, worked on a number of titles, including Brutal Legend, Broken Age, Stacking, and Handlander. He is a member of the GDC Advisory Board, and he's also an active speaker at events in schools across the world. And today he will talk about what exactly is art direction. So, welcome.
All right. I am Lee Petty. That's 17-year-old Lee Petty. I do work at Double Fine. Double Fine Productions is an independent video game developer located in San Francisco. And we've been in business 17 years. I've been there 10 years, which in the video game world is like 70 years. When I started there, my first job there, my first project there rather, was as the art director of Brutal Legend, which was a heavy metal inspired open world action RTS game. And it was cool. We had Jack Black voice our main character. We had all sorts of heavy metal. Got to meet Tim Curry. He played our bondage clad villain. That was pretty cool. And after that project, I had the opportunity to lead my own game, which was a game released in 2011 called Stacking, which was an adventure game set in the world of living Russian nesting dolls. And after that, we do this game jam at Double Fine where we make games in 2 weeks. And sometimes that's public. We film and stream this thing. In 2012, I made this game called Autonomous, which was inspired by VR. This is before VR was an actual thing again. So it was inspired by a VR world. And you constructed robots from found parts and programmed them using simple logic gates to do a variety of things. And that later became a published game for the Leap motion controller system, which no one's probably heard of. And after that, we had a big Kickstarter. Well, for us, it was big. It raised $3.5 million to do this old school adventure game, or rather a 2D adventure game in the style of old school. And that was called Broken Age. And I was the art director on that. And we filmed the entire production of that game, which was about 3 years. And that documentary has been released for free. It's on YouTube. There's like 29 episodes if you want to see a bunch of stressed out game developers occasionally swearing and sometimes doing cool things. And last year, I just shipped another game as project lead called Headlander, which was a side-scrolling action adventure set in the future as it might have been imagined in the 1970s. And you play the last surviving human being, but you're just ahead. Now, normally I would just go right into talking about art direction now, but I wanted to share a little bit about my background with you guys because I know you're in school and you're probably wondering, like, well, if you want to get into video games, how did you get into video games? And this was a long time ago, but I'm going to I'm going to share some things. This is my first video game system. It was, I think, one of the first home game systems. My dad bought this when I was like 7 years old. It was pretty amazing. It was a cartridge-based system, had one button on the joystick, and it was the first time where I beat my dad at something as a 7-year-old. I could already see the tide was changing for technology to defeat the older generation, and he started hiding cartridges from me until he got home from work so he could practice. That led to my Atari 800. This is not my Atari 800. I didn't have all those cool peripherals. But it was a battleship of a computer that had 48K of RAM, 2 cartridge slots, one of which could hold a basic programming cartridge. And I learned to do some basic programming on this. In fact, we used to get magazines, and in desperation for new games, I would I'd stay up all night typing in the programs they'd publish in the back of the video games, and I'd be able to play the game. You'd run a really nasty checksum, make sure the thing didn't crash. Unfortunately, I didn't actually have a tape drive, so if I shut the computer off, I lost that game. But I did spend about 8 hours entering them in every once in a while. And throughout high school, I continued sort of my love of computers and games, and I also sort of had these other interests, which were writing and art. And I never really thought at that point of combining them, and partly because it was so difficult to do so on that hardware. And when I went to college, I decided to focus on art and writing and not computers and or games. And so I went to college, and this is like my high school artwork that I went to college with. I went to San Jose State, and I got a degree in painting and drawing. And when I graduated, I had no idea what I was going to do for a living because people weren't going to pay me money to draw weird things like this. So I had a friend who was working at a company that was about to ride the wave of the CD-ROM revolution. CD-ROMs had just come out. So I joined this game company because there were no artists who knew anything about tech at that time. There was no schools teaching tech or video games or anything. And we made this product, which had a really unfortunate name, Reflux. It's very funny because it's pretty much the storyline of The Matrix way earlier without Keanu Reeves. And what it was a comic book, and we licensed a bunch of movies from Shanghai, and you could click on comic panels and it would dissolve to a Shanghai martial arts film at amazing like 120 by 90 resolution at 12 frames a second. It was a revolution, remember. And it was interesting. We did like 3 of these. We tried to get them in the traditional comic book channels. Didn't do so well. But I learned a lot about that, and it kind of like made me really think like, why am I not combining my interests? Why am I not taking my background in video games and computers and my art training and trying to see if there's any work there? And I landed a job after that at a company called Accolade, which doesn't exist anymore. But Accolade was in San Jose, and was known for a lot of video games going back to the Genesis, I believe. And they were probably best known for series like Test Drive and Jack Nicklaus Golf and Hardball and Star Control. And when I first got a job there, I was going to work on Star Control 4. Here's an image. So Star Control 4, which later became named Starcon, although our French localizers told us that was an unfortunate name. I think there's a joke there, but I don't know what it is. So we had to change the name, but it never got released. And it started life as a PC adventure game, and it switched mid-development to an action PlayStation 1 3D game. So the interesting thing about this time period is this is back when 3D was first starting to become a thing in games. The PlayStation 1 had just come out. There were add-on 3D cards for PCs, and a lot of the artists who were working at these companies were 2D artists. And I got to, unfortunately, watch them lose all their jobs over a year because they either didn't have the interest in learning 3D or the skills to learn 3D. And back then, 3D was relatively technical. It wasn't like it is now. But for me, it was kind of an interesting combination of my 2 interests. The unfortunate thing about this game was it was my first game, and it got canceled at alpha. So after about 18 months of work, the executive decided they didn't want to ship it. And I always think that's a really terrible way to start your career out, but it actually was really good because I learned a lot about what not to do when making a video game. I learned a lot about the value of iteration, about having a good workflow, about being organized, about being technical enough to communicate with the other departments. I don't think I would have learned those lessons so much if my first game wasn't a failure. And in fact, probably my second and third games got canceled as well. But eventually, by the time I left Accolade, which after about 5 years, I did ship a number of games. There's a couple of those. I shipped about 5 games by the time I left. Here's a few. And after that, myself and a few people from Accolade decided we're gonna form our own game studio. We're like, all right, we're gonna show these guys how it's done. This was like 2000, about 2000. And we split off and formed a small company named Circus Freak Studios. Also not a great name if you want to get venture capital investment, by the way. I think they think you're something wrong with you. But we formed that game company, and we got a deal to develop a Superman game, which is, again, a terrible thing. Because Superman games are notoriously terrible and very hard to develop for a variety of reasons. But that was the game that we developed and it shipped for the Xbox, the first Xbox. But we were a small team. We had to build our own game engine from scratch. We had 3 programmers. And we put all of this tech investment and our effort into the Xbox. And the Xbox flopped. And no one was funding Xbox games other than Microsoft. And so we tried to pivot and get more work by switching our tech to PlayStation 2. But at that point, the PlayStation 2 was enormously difficult to develop for from a technical standpoint. And we wound up going out of business. Again, I look at it as great lessons learned, what not to do. And then I wound up at Crystal Dynamics. Now, Crystal Dynamics is still around. They're in Menlo Park. They're probably best known for, currently, for Tomb Raider. But they started business working on titles like Gex and Legacy of Kain and a bunch of 3DO titles, if you guys are familiar with that console. And I worked on a lot of things there. The last few things I shipped before leaving, one of them was Whiplash, which was a platformer where you played a crazy weasel who was chained to an indestructible rabbit, and Project Snowblind, which started life as a Deus Ex game, which is interesting because Deus Ex is one of my favorite franchises. And about halfway through development, a little past halfway through development, the management decided that we needed to change the game. We needed to just sort of, re-art it to be something different because Deus Ex 2 had come out and wasn't doing well in the marketplace. So more than halfway through development, we sort of took the game and went like, what story can we change in this? How can we retheme this? And it became a sort of cyberpunk, futuristic military shooter. Not the best experience to try and reflow your game. But again, I learned some things from that. And hopefully I'm going to share these lessons I've learned from all these with you guys today. The biggest thing I learned is to work for a good studio, which is what I do now. So after I left Crystal Dynamics, I went to Double Fine, and I went over some of the games I've been there for 10 years now. And I really enjoy being there. It's a great studio. And I'll talk a little bit about our process there as well. So I said I was going to talk about art direction, not all of my failed games. So what does an art director do? And this is funny because even people who've been in the industry, the game industry, still don't really know. And that's because it changes a lot from studio to studio, and it certainly changes a lot from industry to industry. An art director in the film industry is a very different job than an art director in the game industry. But if I were to sort of divide the fundamental responsibilities of an art director into three main areas in video games, they would be first, management, two, look development, and three, what I call technical know-how. So management, some art directors do manage, some don't. But the thing about art direction, as implied in the title, it's directing. So that means that it's really important that you have strong communication skills and that you can work with a diversity of people because video games are made by people with very different backgrounds and skill sets. So even if you're not managing a bunch of artists, it's still a very valuable skill to have and to start early on. I would say of all the people that interview, of all the places I've hired people, a third of them don't get hired because they have no ability to meaningfully communicate, even if they're geniuses. There's very few of those people hired nowadays because so much is collaboration. So that's how you can beat a third of your competition. Learn to collaborate. Second one is look development. Now, look development is a lot of what I'll be talking about today. And look development is giving your game a visual style and the processes that are that set that in motion. And so therefore, a lot of art directors have a background in art. So a lot of them come from a traditional art background, if they're as old as I am, or some of the younger artists might come from a 3D background. But either way, they have skills in composition and color and light and shape and form and many of these other fundamentals that are important because they're relevant even in open world 3D games as they are in very simple 2D games. And last, I said technical workflow and know-how. There's very few art directors I work with that are technical artists by trade, as in they're not writing complex scripts or major workflow or pipeline code. But the best art directors, in my opinion, art directors who know how games are made, who really understand how they're made and understand all the pieces that go into that puzzle, and can optimize that process. Because you never have enough time to do what you want to do, and you always want to do more than you're able to do. So working smart and understanding workflow and how to optimize and direct people towards that is a critical skill. If nothing else, I just sort of like to think of it as like I'm not shipping a painting, I'm shipping a game. So if my art knowledge stops at something I'm drawing in Photoshop, then I'm not doing my job. So if that's what an art director is, what is art direction itself? The simple definition I like to use is that art direction is the lens that all of your game's visuals will be realized. And an art direction is about describing that style and an approach to creating it. So when you're working with a group of people, they're always going to want to go in slightly different directions. And one of the roles of art direction is to make sure you're all going in kind of the same direction, but not so much that you're strangling everyone's individual contribution. You want everyone to be able to add and clarify and enhance and improve with their background, their perspective, their skills. And good art direction takes those into account, but then still makes something that at the end of the day feels like a world that's cohesive. I say that we strive for unity but not uniformity, right? Some dissonance is good, but you still need to go in the same direction. And ultimately, art direction is just a series of choices about what to include and what not to include in your game. If we look at a game like Limbo by Playdead, this is a few years old. It's a really interesting game. It came out pretty early days of digital distribution, and their game style is based a lot, their art direction is based a lot on what not to include, right? They didn't include color, obviously, but they also chose to focus on silhouette and shape and form, not on internal details. These assets are pretty quick to make. They spent a lot of time making this game, but each individual asset is not particularly difficult to make. But overall, that puts an emphasis on atmosphere and mood, which is something the game really excels at, instead of high-frequency internal detail. And if you look at their second game, Inside, which came out a year and a half ago or so, you can see them kind of continuing some of those same sensibilities. They've moved the camera to be more dynamic. They've added a little bit of color. There's a little bit of internal detail, maybe resulting in a more developed sense of world, but there's still a lack of detail in terms of internal detail and focusing more on shapes. I think it suits the game really well. Something else that is often said when I talk to people, especially those people who maybe don't have an art background, is that design is king. Art's not necessary. Visuals get in the way. They slow down iteration. We don't need them. And there might be some truth to that, but the truth of that is more about fidelity, and fidelity is not art direction. Fidelity is, there's many definitions, but it's really about how much money you spend on the visuals, and art direction is not about that. So if we look at a game like The Division, it's a beautiful game, right? It has style. There's certainly a lot of art direction at work here, but what we're looking at is a lot of money. We're looking at all sorts of high-frequency detail spread all over a large city. You can imagine how long it would take a group of people to make all these assets. And these aren't incidental assets, you know, whether it was outsourcers or internal. That's a lot of fidelity, and that's a choice they made. But if you look at a game like Kentucky Route Zero, most people would not describe this as high fidelity, right? We have a low polygon count, very few textures, flat shapes. But I think this game has a fantastic sense of style. It's fantastic art direction that suits the mood and the gameplay of this game very well. It's a lot of their art direction is about composition and shape and striking graphic design. So why should you care about art direction? What does art direction do for your game? It does a lot of things for the game. And like I said, it shouldn't be seen as a separate discipline in many ways. It's hand in hand with design and tech. But it does do a few things that may be a little bit better. Now, each discipline does. So one of those is identity. And for me, identity is just the idea that you want your game to stand out. You don't want your game to look like everyone else's, unless someone's paying you to make it look like someone else, I suppose. But you want it to be memorable. There's a lot of games out there. There's a lot of people making games. You want to do something that people haven't done before. And the idea is that your visual style, your art direction can help make your game instantly recognizable. If we look at a game like Cuphead, which came out a few weeks ago, Cuphead, there's no other game that looks like this. Every single screenshot of this game that anyone sees, they're like, oh, it's Cuphead. Or if they don't know the name, they'll remember it when they later see the title. And that's what a game with a strong identity has. It's instantly recognizable, even from a single screenshot out of context. Now, I had to put a death metal reference in here, because that's a requirement for every talk I do. But this is a poster from the Bay Area Death Fest 2. And it's filled with logos from death metal bands, which are these indecipherable scrawls. But one innovative band decided, my death metal logo, Party Cannon, I guess the backwards R means they're metal. You know, like, okay, maybe not the best death metal logo, but very strong identity in the context of this, right? Like, people are going to gaze at that poster and they're going to remember Party Cannon. If you look at a group of screenshots from some war-themed shooters, these are all different games, right? I can't tell them from each other. Now, certainly some of this is intentional, right? They're probably trying to carve out a very specific niche and market. But it's not just that I chose screenshots that support my point here. These are all very similar in terms of color, composition, focus on the subject matter, the focus on high frequency detail, the shape language. They're all very, very similar. This is really poor identity. And maybe they can do that because it's a very established genre, but a lot of smaller indie games cannot. And if we look at screenshot of some indie games, some of them in development, some of them done. There's a much broader diversity here in terms of aesthetic treatments and styles, and they're much more memorable, especially when seen as a group. Now, you also want your game to have appeal. Now, different people have different tastes, so I'm not suggesting there's one universal aesthetic. That's a marketing job. I think that different things will always appeal to different people, and ultimately you need to follow what interests you. However, the idea of appeal is that you want to try to connect through people, just through beauty. Everything else in your game aside, you want them to want to be in your world or be challenged by your game, whatever the focus of your game is. If you look at a game like Ori and the Blind Forest, this is an incredibly lush, beautiful game. And this is just a screenshot from it. But just seeing those characters feel like they have a story to tell. Those characters feel like they have a relationship with each other. That world feels like it's ready to be explored. And it's not just indie games, 2D games that can do this. You know, when the new Mirror's Edge first came out, I thought this was an incredibly appealing world, especially in the realm of AAA, which tends to be neck stabbing. You know, this was like, hey, there's a really interesting treatment on this city. It's got a strong graphic design. It's got a minimal palette. The main character is not wearing a chainmail bikini and wielding a weapon. Like, these are all very appealing things, and I think they appeal to a broader group of people, and people want to play that world. So visuals also, and I think this is probably maybe the biggest function your art direction can do for you, your style, is just readability. And so readability, my definition of readability is just the arrangement of all the elements of your scene, including the color and the interactive elements and non-interactive elements. They're there to tell the player what they can interact with, where they can go. Without readability, people are confused. If you ever sit through play test of your game, you'll be pulling your hair out, and a lot of the time it's readability. If you look at a game like Monument Valley, it's a beautiful game. It has really great readability, right? It's funny because in some ways this game is about confusing the player about where the path is and how to solve that, but it's always very clear where you can walk. It's always very clear with the interaction language, what is a player path, what is midground, what is background, what is just art design. And so it has great readability. And here's Gears of War 3. I'm really not picking on shooters. But Gears of War 3, you know, this particular screenshot is really, really poor readability. I don't really, again, when it's in motion, it's a little easier to see, of course, but I have a hard time picking the enemy off the background. I don't know where my character is. I'm not entirely sure which of those are cover objects other than the one in front of me. It is just not good. Now, they have a much harder problem than Monument Valley. When you have a 2D game with a constrained camera, you can frame things using 2D compositional tricks like film, but when the player is spinning around a third-person camera, it's more challenging. However, you can still do it. There are still some of the same techniques that can be applied, and this is not a good example of that. Now you look at another bad example of readability is Mad World, right? Like, I like this game. It's super crazy and weird, but when you pick a strong black and white style like this, that's with a lot of guys moving around on the screen, it's really hard. You've given yourself a big challenge. It's a solvable challenge, and I would suggest that you could look at maybe other non-video game sources that have high contrast black and white styles for some clues. You've got Mike Mignola's Hellboy on the right, and that's a illustration from Franklin Booth on the left. Again, easier problem when I'm just showing it in 2D, but you can see that they've used their lights and darks very cleverly to guide the eye, and Franklin Booth has also used line weight to create a better sense of depth and focal point, so you know what you're looking at. So if you give yourself a style that's like that, do some research, figure out who did it well. So visuals also are good at communicating theme. Now, ultimately, they always say movies are show, don't tell, and games are play, don't show, right? But I think visuals communicate right away. They can communicate your theme immediately at a first glance. Mechanics and narration probably communicate your theme more deeply and profoundly in games, but they take time. So when you, again, getting back to when people first see your game and introduced to this game, you want them to understand what it is. These visuals need to tell the same story as the rest of your game. So we look at Journey, right? So Journey is a game about discovery. It's about exploration. It's about many things, but this journey is also a metaphor for the life cycle, right? And it's kind of solitary in some ways. When you look at a screenshot of this, these are communicating some of the same ideas. There's this vast, empty landscape for you to explore, lots of different directions to go. You're not sure where to go, and you've got this sort of like end-of-life mountain in the distance, sort of guiding you all the time with a sort of ethereal quality pointing up. And the game's mechanics are very streamlined, and that's even communicated by the player character, right? The mechanics of this game are mainly about flow and movement. The character doesn't have arms. It can't hold or pick up or shoot, right? When you see this thing in motion, you see the flowing robe, and that really emphasizes what you're going to be spending most of your time doing. And the other aspect of this game is that it has this really amazing cooperative experience where you can connect with people that just show up in your game or you show up in theirs. And because the landscape is not cluttered with detail, but still remains evocative and beautiful, when you see another person in that landscape, you see them and it's that much more powerful because of that. And ultimately, the game is like I said, this is all communicated with the gameplay itself, but these visuals also communicate it right away, and you see that even before playing it. I have a cold, so I'm going to drink some water. Excuse me for a minute. All right. So I think one of the problems I've encountered with visual style and art direction is that there isn't a common language for talking about different elements of it. And so when you want to talk to artists, or as an artist yourself, you want to think about which decisions do I want to make. We need some language, a framework for that. So I have a framework I use that I'm going to share with you guys. Because usually what I find is that people have this sort of spectrum that starts on one side you have cartoony, sometimes it goes to stylized, then photoreal, and then the elusive hyperreal, whatever that means, right? And that's fine, like, you know, it gives you a super broad stroke of what the game is, but it's not really meaningful. So instead, I have the 4 Fs. And these are different elements, different ways of sort of thinking about art direction and style. And they do overlap each other like anything complex. They're not completely succinct, but I'm going to speak that like they are because it's easier to describe them that way. And those elements are frame, form, focus, and filter. So frame is pretty simple, right? It's the when and where. It's the place and time. Where does your game take place? It doesn't actually have to be, even if your game is a strange metaphorical thing that doesn't take place on a real timeline, it's still helpful for you to sort of think about those things because your visual style, your art direction, will be affected in small ways and in large ways by that decision. So if we look at the game L.A. Noire, now that game, they've said this game is set in Los Angeles in 1947, right? So obviously that time period has a huge impact on their style, right? The signage, the graphic design, the cars, the way the city looks, these are all informed by that time period. And here's an actual photo of LA in 1947. And it's interesting to see them because you can see certain commonalities, but you can see that they're still making very specific style choices in addition to that. They're not only about that time period. They're not being historically accurate in many ways, probably. But it still really informed everything, and including their palette, you know, which had this sort of sepia-toned glaze like one might remember vintage things, even though they weren't that color, right? And if we look at a game, Kentucky Route Zero, I love this game, so I'm going to mention it a lot. It's really beautiful. And the interesting thing about this game is, presumably it's set in Kentucky, unless the 5th episode reveals a big surprise. But they don't ever really say, as far as I can recall anyways, a specific time period. But looking at a lot of the imagery and the themes in this game, it's clear to me that they took some influence from the Great Depression in the 1920s. And there's some images from the Great Depression in the American 1920s and some screenshots from their game. And, you know, those little choices can just help you make your world, even if you don't expose them to the player. When we worked on Brutal Legend, you know, we had hypothetical time periods where there's a real world time period, but we had like this origin of the world and all these sort of things, most of which isn't directly exposed to the player, but it helps you frame your entire world and makes those choices. We're working on Psychonauts 2 now at Double Fine, and one of my first questions of the team was like, well, when's it set? And they're like, well, we haven't really thought about that. I'm like, well, you have a telephone in the first scene. Like, is it a 1980s telephone? Is it a 1960s telephone? That's a big difference. Those form the fabric that make your game memorable. So form, so when you hear artists talk about style, they're mainly talking about what I call form. And so that tends to be like the shape language, the colors. Are things proportionally realistic? Are they simplified? They'll often refer to maybe a time period of art history time period. That all kind of gets, for me, encapsulated by form. A good example of that is Team Fortress 2. It's been out for a while, but the interesting thing about this game, when I was making, you know, more AAA style games around the time this came out, it was believed that visual style was bad, that art direction that was distinct would just make sure that people don't want to buy your game. And then these guys came out with this, which at the time was very, very different than, especially for a shooter, a team class-based shooter. And in fact, it started out for the World War II shooter, and they switched visual styles on it. And the interesting thing about this style, and one of the reasons I like it, is not only does it embody all those things I said in the first part, it's got a great identity, it's got appeal, but it also is perfect for their game. So what they've done for their form is they've pushed and simplified the silhouettes of these characters, because in this game, which is a team-based multiplayer game, it's important that you can instantly recognize what class of their players are playing. So they've pushed these silhouettes to communicate that. You know, obviously, like the big guy with the machine gun is this big bulky guy. Looks like he'd probably move slower. And the spy is this sort of untrustworthy, wiry-looking fellow. Those silhouettes are not only memorable just in an art sense and appealing, but they also support the gameplay clearly. And they have nice big color fields to help distinguish team colors. Now, they took their inspiration from the golden age of illustration, or silver age, depending on who you ask. Cornwell, Rockwell, J.C. Leyendecker. And you know, if you look at this, you may not draw a direct correlation, but if you look closely, you can see that these illustrations really are simplifying down the way that forms are rendered and shaded. They have very distinct shapes and limited color palettes, and they look to that for their influence, but made it their own. And they even carried that sensibility over to the environment, right? They stayed with that sort of constrained color palette. The characters have great readability off the background, but the background still feels like it's part of that world. And they've taken the same approach to simplifying shapes. I mean, that rock could pretty much be a character, right? They've simplified that. I mean, look at this guy's silhouette, look at the rock silhouette. They're in the same neighborhood. So the third F is focus. So focus is just the visual idea that you feel like you're going to do better than other people, the thing that you want to help inform other choices in your game. It could be, you know, focus on detail, on lighting. You want to have 100 things moving on screen, fluid animation. It could be anything, really. Shadow of the Colossus is one of my favorite games. And for me, their focus is an emphasis on scale. Seems obvious, right? But it's not just in the difference between the main character scale and the Colossus's scale, which is vast. You know, they go out of their way with their dynamic camera system to always try and use camera language to frame and emphasize that scale. They'll put it down low, you know, kind of pull the character up and show this huge looming thing in the background. They also, because the environment is also vast, and for them, and again, I haven't spoken to the developers, so this is my interpretation, but I think that sense of emptiness, of loneliness, is part of the theme of their game as well. So that focus on scale really supports that. And you can see even in these sort of incidental architecture, there's a focus on scale. The characters are quite small on screen compared to other larger things. And it gives their world and their game a very different feel. Lastly is the fourth F, filter. I said that art direction can be seen as the sort of lens that all of your game's visuals are realized. Filter is kind of a specific, or almost like a tweak on that. Like it's a finer version of that same idea. So the idea is that you know, you might say, for example, want your game as if it had been rendered through the eyes of a madman, or as if Francis Bacon, same thing, had painted you know, your visuals. Or maybe it's based on a technical limitation, like you want to do a pixel art game and it's 320 by 240, so you're giving it the filter with those technical limitations, or it has a CRT-like approach. It's kind of a hard one to wrap your head around, but it actually leads to some really interesting styles. So Hotline Miami is a game based in this sort of like late 80s, 90s style vibe, you know, and they have VHS and CRT influences in their game. And you can see the scan lines here, and if you've played the game, you can kind of sense that in a lot of different things. So they're bringing that as a filter. They're kind of viewing this game as though it were made in the early 90s, right? And that actually extends to the gameplay itself, right? Their visual style, yes, it's pixel art, and a lot of people do pixel art, but the presentation of their particular type of pixel art and font choices are evocative of that particular era. So they're kind of applying that filter on top of all their other sensibilities. Child of Light was a RPG that came out a little while ago, and you know, they were going for a fairy tale storybook kind of feel with their game. And I think you can see in this that it has that feeling, but they really wanted to push it further. And so if you look in the sort of close-ups of their game, they wanted to apply this kind of watercolor sensibility, this watercolor filter on top of everything. So you can even see the emulated paper texture. And I saw a talk by these guys, and they would scan in watercolor paintings and remix them and to make digital brushes out of them and really try and push that idea further. And again, I think to the end of trying to create this idea of a fairy tale story. Now I want to look at a couple of games and go through all 4 of their Fs together. These are not my games. These are other games. So this is my interpretation, but this is how I would describe those styles. So Fallout 3. So the frame, again, it's not, I don't know that it's ever specified, but it's a future post-apocalyptic world, right? Set in the United States. Fallout 3 specifically is in the East Coast. For their form, they have a limited palette, right? This is the palette I put together based on playing that game. This is where they spend almost all of their colors. They've constrained their palette down to this very limited thing. And those colors in particular, used the way they're using, are a very bleak world indeed. The other aspect of their form that's interesting is, although in general they tend to treat their characters with realistic proportions, if you actually look at their enemy design, you'll actually see that they're a little bit more comic booky than most of the humans. Now I think part of that is probably in service of readability. By bumping that saturation up and exaggerating those shapes, you can pick them off the background even more. But I think the other part of that is they do have this underlying comic book aesthetic. Like if you find, there's these comic books you can find, this Ridiculous Barbarian comic that kind of runs throughout the thing. And they have a sense of humor and satire throughout the game as well. So I think that speaks to that, and that's probably why they made those choices. The focus of the game certainly is on open world exploration. The game gives you very low parameters in terms of what order you need to do things and where you need to go, and a lot of it is built around that. That's the standout feature, right? Now their filter is interesting because I think their filter is what makes the game, for me, memorable, which is they've applied this sort of 1950s Cold War bomb shelter, 50s Americana aesthetic on top of everything. You can see it in things like the Pip-Boy, just your basic interface into the game, and also just the sort of like signage and books and everything that are throughout the whole game. And I think that provides a little relief from the otherwise completely bleak and serious game, and gives it its own style. It's not a choice that other studios would have necessarily made at the time. So to contrast that 3D game, I also have a 2D indie game I want to talk about, which is Guacamelee, another great game. Guacamelee is, its frame is ostensibly set in a small Mexican town. I don't believe they ever say the location, at least in real world terms. And it feels historical to me. You don't see cars, so they've made it, I don't know what the time frame is, but you don't see cars and certain modern technology. You could probably guesstimate about where it is based on the lamps and other things. And their form is interesting. Their form, they went for very bold, angular graphic shapes. That's their game on the left. But when I saw it, it reminded me a lot of like Tarkovsky, like Samurai Jack and other animated series along those lines. And those are interesting because those are those sort of simplified shapes are really great for emphasizing action. And they are an action game. Now, in terms of focus, they have a couple, but the biggest one, I would say, is their focus on this dual world. They have this living world and a dead world, and of course it affects the game mechanically and thematically, but also visually. So you can see the same locations on the left and the right in the worlds that you can switch between. And if you look closely, it's not just the color palette that they're swapping. You can see like the statue on top goes from a wrestler to kind of a dead character, right? And some of the nature of some of the shops stay the same, some of them change quite a bit. And that relates to their filter as well. And their filter, I think, is 2 big things. So one is, as I mentioned, the Day of the Dead. They have a lot of imagery in the afterworld about the Day of the Dead, and you can see a lot of those patterns and motifs throughout the game. The lead concept artist is from Mexico City, so I'm sure he brought his experience to that. But it's not just about that, it's also about wrestling, right? And it's not just that the main character is a wrestler and that's the story. They use that idea as a filter. When you go to fight a boss, they introduce the bosses as if it's a wrestling match, as if there's 2 luchadors squaring off, right? And in a few other areas as well. So they've really incorporated that filter and not just left it as a background for the character. So we're about halfway through, and they asked me to stop and pause for some questions right now. So we could maybe do like 5 minutes of questions, and then I can go back and keep going. Does that sound about right, 5 minutes? Yeah? So if you have questions, what's a normal question here? What's the process? Is it to scream it out, rush the stage, raise a hand? Yeah.
We can repeat it. Just ask.
I will repeat the questions, yes. Who has a question? You, sir. So the question is, when developing an art direction or visual style around your personal illustration style, is that the question?
No, like without a good illustrative background.
Oh, I see. If you don't have a good...
To play to your strengths in other media, such as film and cinematography,
Right.
or to develop the traditional visual practices.
That's a good question. So the question is, if you're not, let's say, have a strong illustration background and you're trying to develop a style for your game, is it best to play to your strengths? So the short answer is yes, it's best to play to your strengths. I think hopefully those strengths are what make you unique as a game developer, and you'll make choices that other people won't make. That being said, I think it's, I'm going to go through a little bit later the process I would use to approach it, even if you're not an illustrator. I've never believed that my job as an artist is to develop a single signature style and try and ram that into every game I work on. I like to look at the nature of what the game, what is the game trying to communicate, what's it about, and try and bring, of course I'm going to have my own biases and styles, but try and choose a style based on that. And a lot of that's just research and playing games and looking outside games. So. Any other questions? There's going to be like a huge cash prize. Oh. He won.
You mentioned that one of the things which you're tackling as an art director is taking different artists and achieving some sort of unity, if not, but not uniformity. I'm interested in if you see any of those principles apply to other disciplines as well. For example, if I'm working on, say, my final project with 3 other team members, and we're all going maybe in different directions with the game design, if there's any tools or processes which you found useful in unifying that perspective.
Pit combat. No, yes. Yeah, and that's totally natural, right? Like that happens on every project, even if you've been in the industry for a long time and are an old man like myself. So it is something you're just gonna have to always deal with. And I think the best way is to figure out what's really important to you and why it's important to you. And is it going to, if your goal is to make the best game possible with this group of people, then you need to play to each other's strengths and listen to each other. Oftentimes, the simple way to do that is just simply divide areas and then take feedback. So the common example that I see even in bigger game production is level design, right? Level designers are often paired with level artists and a concept artist, and they're given more ownership of that particular area. And the sort of lead designer and creative director are giving them inputs like, this is where that level fits in the arc of the game. This is why these things are important for you to understand. This is how it has to flow. So, so you're giving them that feedback, and but they still have enough autonomy to pursue those ideas how they want. But then they ask for feedback because you do learn. So feedback is painful. Going through art school, all you get is feedback. Basically, people telling you everything you do is terrible. And it's not necessarily what I'd recommend as a process, but you do learn that ultimately. Almost everything gets better with feedback, assuming it's coming from a genuine place. So my recommendation would be to meet, talk about and agree on high-level goals, divide responsibilities, be respectful of each other's responsibilities, but free to give each other feedback constructively. Any other questions? You.
For those of us who are building games but may not have art skills or really anything to speak of, or there are some just like basic tips and tricks that you develop for like just showcasing some of your own style in simplistic ways?
Yeah, absolutely. The second half I'll hopefully talk to that a little bit more and show some examples of that. But I would say that it's always better to sort of start simply. And there are examples of evocative visual styles that are very simple out there. I think, I was just trying to think, so there's a game called Thomas Was Alone. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And that's got a really interesting style. And Mike Bithell, the creator, is not an artist. He has a sensibility. But he did that game, I think, by himself. And it's just, it's pretty much squares. But he arranged them in such a way that was evocative. You probably know someone who's an artist. You could ask for feedback. And also just, it's just like anything else. Art is not a mystical thing. It's a science too. There are simple steps, well maybe they're not so simple, but there are steps and components that make things work or not work. And part of that is just looking out, spending time to look out there, what is working, and take a little time to analyze why. But yeah, less is more if you're not an artist. Yeah. All the way in the back with the hat. Yeah, so yes. So what advice would I give an artist or someone who's visually oriented who wants to learn more of the technical skills for video game development? I think there's a few things I recommend. One is try and make a simple game yourself. Like even if you're just hopelessly frustrated, you'll sort of understand like what's involved in a basic game loop and what you don't know. And nowadays there's so many game engines out there, you can get that, and you can kind of play with those things. The other thing I'd recommend is maybe not worry about making a game, but use the game engine to make a piece of art. And that sort of implies I think games aren't art, and that's not what I meant. But something that isn't interactive necessarily. So, download Unity or Unreal Engine and make something, draw yourself a concept, make something in 3D, in very simple 3D, and put it in a scene and light it. Learn to use sequencer and put a camera in it. You're kind of going through all the aspects of the tools, and you're necessarily going to pick up some technical things. If you get that working, we'll go, well, maybe I'll just look at Blueprint and see if I can make the light turn on when I get closer as a player. And you can look most of that stuff up on YouTube, and it's quite straightforward. And over time, you'll just pick it up. I found that most artists are happy to do that because it gives you a little more control, and it gives you a little more freedom to experiment with something that maybe you can't articulate in a 2D image, but you could kind of like mock up real quick in 3D and throw it in a scene and go, well, what if this is kind of compelling, right? Just to walk through this arch with the parallax, and the level designer might go, oh yeah, that is pretty cool, or a programmer might go, what the heck did you do to that shader? That's like 5,000 instructions, but might see that there's something compelling there and can write it in 50 for you, right? So, yeah. Okay. Let's get back to the presentation. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. Okay, so let's talk about creating that visual style, about art direction and how to approach it. So I feel like if you look around, you're going to see a lot of information like this, which is, where do I start? And you'll see like, oh, well, here's how Pixar does it, right? Look at this beautiful color script that goes over all the emotional beats of their movie. Or look at these great model sheets that show all these costumes and poses for every character. Or hey, we've got a sculptor on staff who just sculpts these things from thin air so you can kind of look at this character in real life and decide whether you think it's going to make a compelling thing. Or hey, every beat of our game is storyboarded out. Movie, in this case. And these are really good techniques, but this is if you've got a full staff of artists and a lot of time and a lot of resources, and it's not the most direct way to a compelling visual style, especially if you're making a small game. So I won't say throw these ideas out, but don't worry about them yet. Instead, start here. Start very simply. I have found, honestly, one of the most effective tools for getting started on visuals is not to be visual, is to just write lists of stuff. This is my, I think this is one of the first things I wrote down for stacking. I always make these lists. I'm like some weird obsessive serial killer writing lists on everything. And it's not tasks I'm giving myself. I'm just quickly blowing through associated ideas, and maybe I'll doodle some crappy little sketch there. But it's not important. I'm just seeing where this leads me. And maybe you're working with someone who's already done this for you, or someone else who's responsible for writing the game, and then ask them for the list. We're like, well, can you write down 10 keywords? Just start simply. Just try and get to the heart of that. And when you have these words, just go, well, let's do some reference. Let's do some research. And the interesting thing about reference is I feel like there's a couple gotchas with reference. So what I see happen a lot is people are like, okay, I want reference. I'm going to go and look. I'm going to save a bunch of stuff off Pinterest or Google or whatever. And you're going to wind up with these directories with like 10,000 images in them. And you're going to be like, okay, now I have 10,000 images. Where do I start? So I think it's important when you collect reference to always take the next step, which is to make a mood board. And mood boards are widely used. This is a mood board I put together for Headlander's first level. And people approach them different ways. In my case, I don't like to make mood boards from the same medium I'm working in. So if I'm working in video games, I don't like to pull from video games for my mood boards. If I don't like to pull illustration. If it's 2D, I try and use film or cinematography or photography. But the idea with mood boards is that you look for this bunch of images you have, and you're going to go through a selection process. You're going to pick like the 10 or 12 most important images that you think collectively communicate an idea. So this is an area of the Headlander, one of the first levels, called the pleasure port, which is this sort of like fake hedonistic part of the game. And so I was looking at 70s science fiction for a lot of this, but also like architecture. There's a JFK terminal down there and a few other things that I thought communicated some of these ideas. Later on in the game, you get to like a much more dystopian area that's more pyramidal and science focused, and I pulled this reference from that. So these are from movies, and I think maybe all from movies. I went and pulled reference, and I chose these. And so these boards together help you form an idea. And so my suggestion is that pull your references you would normally don't worry about, but then always go through that selection process. And then don't make 100 mood boards. Make 1 or 2 for your game, if you're a small game. Because if you just make 10 or 20, you'll be like, look at all these great images, and everyone will be like, where are we at? I don't get it. You have to make that selection process. And my other motto when it comes to visuals is any decision is better than no decision, because no decision is the tool making your decision or fate, and that's a crappy decision. So make the decision, and if it's an arbitrary decision, so be it. A lot of the best visual styles come out of arbitrary limitations. Another thing about research, I would say, is that when you go to Google or wherever and you're pulling your images, what a lot of people do is they'll just pull the first few images that come up and go, okay, I'm throwing this on a mood board, we're done. And it's worth understanding things a little bit more. So when I worked on stacking, I started looking for, of course, I was going to have Russian dolls in the game. That was the focus of the game. So there's a lot of these images on the internet, like tons of these painted Russian dolls. But what sort of world would these dolls exist in? Like I could go the really like expected way and go, well, they're in Russia, and put some Kremlins in the background. But I wanted to understand more, like, well, how would whoever painted this think of a world? And so in pulling these images and just doing the most cursory research, I found out that the Russian dolls painting tradition comes from a bigger tradition of Russian lacquer box painting, which predates it. And the interesting thing about this is a lot of the same goals. There's a very similar style. They are there to illustrate fairy tales and myths and other things like that. But I got to see like, oh, look, there's how they would paint a tree. And they're working with certain technical limitations. They're painting on the slick surface, just like the dolls, and with a certain type of paint. So they make a certain like linear choice. There's a lot of like little swirls and lines left in their painting style, which is kind of unique. And so when I went to paint textures for stacking, this is a texture I painted, I adopted a lot of those. And so this isn't Russia, it's a Victorian steamship. But I still used a lot of that research and those ideas to inform some of those shapes that I would have not otherwise found had I not done a little more research, other than just pulling images. So concept art is something you probably hear a lot, like, yeah, you know, when people make AAA games, they've got this huge team of concept artists, and the stuff you see that comes out is really cool, but it's actually a little bit more about illustration. Concept art, when you're working on a game, is often garbage. It's just really quick. And the reason for that is concept art's goal, most of the time, is about ideas. It's about design. It's actually not about illustration. Illustration is about just like a beauty image. And yes, concept art has some of those. I mean, these are concept art we did for Headlander that are kind of like shot design and a little more illustrative in nature. Here's a couple of these. But this is deceiving because unless you're making a game about concept art, you don't want to spend your entire game trying to make your 3D game look like a piece of concept art, unless that's your goal. Otherwise, why are you spending so much time on it? So what I would recommend you do instead, if you have a group of artists, or even if not, is do an art jam. And this is something we did on Broken Age, and there's a documentary about it if you want to watch all of us drawing on there. But you can see what's on the table on the whiteboard. These are very simple drawings, and we just sat back there for like a week and just jammed out ideas. But we're doing it collaborative. We're out of our comfort zone. We're not in front of all of our reference. We're not on computers. We're just using pencils and paper to get ideas out and give each other feedback and put them on the wall. One of the great tragedies of art as it relates to the digital technology is that when you see art put together on a wall physically, your brain processes that totally differently, in my opinion, than paging through thumbnails. There's a type of simultaneous pattern recognition, I don't know what the hell, but it's very different. So if you have a wall, stick stuff up on a wall, anything. And the images that came out of this, what's interesting about this is they're very simple, right? So this is Peter Chan, and I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Chan's work, but he's a beautiful, beautiful illustrator. beautiful man. He's just like a great guy, and he's a really solid artist. But this is very, very rough for him, right? The interesting thing about this game, about this drawing, is that he was into this idea that in the boy's spaceship, one of the main characters, is that the spaceship would be protective over him and knit things for him, and it'd be like this mother-like figure, and everything would be like soft plushies. And so that idea lasted through the whole game, and we created characters who were completely made of yarn and these weird yarn things, and that just came from this one drawing, this one idea that he was just drawing, and it's half text, right? Scott Campbell, another one of the artists we work a lot, did these little, as he called them, ship dudes. The interesting thing about this is that this became the foundation for Hex Pals, these little characters that are like these little charming companions of the boy in the game. And the idea of using the hex as a basis for the entire ship's visual design and architecture, just this one arbitrary choice. I saw this, I'm like, we're basing the whole ship on a hex. And he's like, all right. Like, that wasn't his idea, right? But that was just sort of an arbitrary thing because I like these guys. And then it became an in-joke because then, like, the older ship, turns up in the backstory, was a diamond. So the hex was better because it had 2 more sides. You know, like, these things just take you to strange places and you go with it. I did these pencil drawings for a Maiden Fest. So early on in the game, the main female character was going to walk through a city, and she didn't know she was about, the player doesn't know that she's about to be sacrificed to a monster. So we were going to foreshadow that by having these kids all in these like cute multi-eyed monster costumes, like, yay, the party's here, you're going to be devoured type stuff. Ultimately, that was cut from the game, but we still carried a lot of these ideas over into the actual Maiden Fest, where they're implanted in birthday cakes. Lastly, just one more of these. So I put this here just because Bagel, one of the other artists, that's his name, he's not. He is a painter, so he does these watercolors in like 5 minutes. And, you know, so for him, this is a rough sketch. And, you know, but you can see like he's bringing a sense of color that maybe those other ones didn't have. And this character, this mom character that the ship computer manifested itself as, we took that just from this one painting. And it was just him going, hey, I'm bored, Mom, right? So you don't know where these ideas are going to lead you, and it's not about trying to get a perfect image. Hey, if you're a talented artist like Bagel, you can make a perfect image while you're doing it. But really, my point is this, that it is okay to do shitty paint overs. I do a lot of these. I'm going to show you some of my shitty paint overs. And so if you're not a concept artist, getting back to the earlier question, if you're not an illustrator and you want to move your style forward, one of the best ways to do it is take a screen capture of your game in progress and paint on it in Photoshop or GIMP or whatever you want to use. And again, not with the end of trying to make a pretty painting out of it, but doing quick visual experiments. Be like, well, what did this level look like if it was bright green? You know, that sort of stuff, right? That's really quick. Anyone can do them. It doesn't have to come from an artist. So this is an early shot of Brutal Legend when these were the headbanger mines, when there was a bunch of headbangers using their heads to smash solid rock to harvest car parts for the Hair Glam Rock Coalition. I know, it doesn't make much sense. So this was like an earlier version of it, and it did not at all sell this concept. We wanted this like heavy metal forge sort of feel. And so I took this and I just did this very simple paint over. And there's I didn't draw anything here, right? Like I just put some color overlays in Photoshop, right? Now obviously I'm using my knowledge of color and limiting the palette, but there's not much art there per se. And then you just put notes on there. Because putting these notes on there just sort of like tells you what you're going for. Then you see the bottom, I'm like, we're going for a steamy lava pit. Unify the color scheme, right? Like, I could have spent a lot of time painting that, or I could just be like, screen capture here, and then people can respond to that. You know, someone might take that and go, well, what if the fires were bigger and just like, you know, scaled the fire up or took a photo off the internet and pasted it on there. It doesn't have to be beautiful. You can iterate super quickly that way. Here's another shot, a very early shot of stacking. And this was very plain. There wasn't much going on. And one of the tricks with this game is it was sort of taking place in this implied diorama world, but because we didn't have a lot of human scale, it was kind of difficult to sell that. You can see they have like toothpick wheels and things like that. But I just sort of took that and did, again, look how ugly my painting is there. It doesn't matter, right? What my goal here was to do this. My goal was to lead the eye, to define the playable space a little bit better. So I used the orange colors to frame the player path. I added some suitcases, which I knew we already have, to put them receding into perspective to give a better sense of scale since you didn't have a lot of real world reference there. And just a few other notes in there. These are very simple. Lighting is one of my favorite things to iterate on. So this is a shot from Costume Quest 2. And the project lead was not happy with this lighting. It wasn't, and you can see it was kind of bland. And so we wanted to unify it again and give it more of a strong feel. So this is like an oppressive neighborhood as ruled by an evil dentist in the future. So you have to keep that in mind. That's why we have all those weird propaganda dental posters on the walls. But so I simplified the color scheme, but I also focused it around the gameplay, which the gameplay involves going door to door and trick-or-treating, and then the lights turn off. So we darkened the image, simplified this color scheme to pull that out a bit more, and we also wanted a variant where it would like be at night after a certain game thing happened. So a real quick change, right? And I left the doors orange because you still had that gameplay there, so you still needed to see that. But this doesn't, you know, I'm not saying there's no art skill involved with this, but this is not about prettiness. This is about ideas. This is about getting them out. You know, you can do 50 of these in an hour. So detail. Here's another question that I think people assume that you need in a game for strong visual styles. You need detail. You need normal maps and all that stuff. Well, you know, for certain styles you do. But I'm going to show you an example of something that. So this is my amazing model I did for this talk, right? These are just cubes, nothing but cubes, copied everywhere with default lighting. Now I did make a cube slightly more evocative of a human figure just so we had some sense of scale. This is terrible, right? This is, if I was like, this is my level, look how awesome it is. Don't you want to play this? You'd be like, nope. Now, some people will go, okay, we'll take this, we'll go do a concept, we're going to go make some textures, we're going to do some models, we'll put them in, we'll see if we broke the game design because we did all that. I would say, how about we don't do any of that first? How about we just add a little bit of lighting, right? I didn't change any of the models, but now I have a sense of depth. I have a possibly, like, I didn't intend it, but that giant weird obelisk is kind of evocative now. It's in the distance. You're like, oh, what's that doing there? Maybe it's toward, you know, going to there. At the very least, you have a sense of depth and space, and you can kind of get a sense of whether the space could possibly work for whatever your goals are. And this is all low frequency detail. This is just simple lighting done in Engine. You might go, well, I don't know, do you think this space would work in an outdoor environment? What if we wanted to be more dusty? Well, we'll just change the lighting really quick. Like, let's not worry about models yet. Let's not build a cactus and everything else. Like, does this have the same sense of space you might want? These are simple lighting adjustments, and I'm doing them on block mesh. You might think that you want something set more at night. What if we wanted this to feel more urban? Well, let's just change the lighting slightly. Okay, so to be fair, I did put some full bright untextured yellow polys in the distance, but there's no modeling fidelity here. A non-artist can do this, right? All I did was, through observation, realize that buildings are usually lit from the bottom at night. So I turned the lighting and had it face up. I picked a palette. You could Photoshop sample off any photo and go, okay, that's closer to where we want to go. This doesn't take any time. Don't spend your time on models first. Do the low frequency lighting and composition experiments first. Another thing that is important to remember is that, like I said earlier, you're not shipping a painting, you're shipping a game. And one of the things that games do is they move, right? They're dynamics. Things change over time. Obviously, your game mechanics will usually speak to that. But even in 2D games, you can really focus a lot on this. When we were working on Broken Age, this is a painting from one of our scenes in Broken Age. It was made up of multiple screens. Well, the original idea is we were inspired by old school adventure games. But the thing about old school adventure games is they're just static screens. And as much as I loved them, I mainly loved them for the writing, the world never really felt like a space I could go into. So what we did is we just simply split this up into layers, right? So when we painted this, we painted these all in layers. And when we reassembled them, we put them at a different hypothetical depth from the camera. It's not a real camera. So when you move around, they all move at different rates. Parallax is a very simple way to add movement. I'll show you a quick video of that. So this was a development version of Broken Age. So this is an all 2D game. So we added a little bit of movement to the environment just to keep it alive, so it doesn't feel exact like, we don't want to feel like you're walking in front of a painting. We want to feel like the painting is what you're in. And parallax is a very simple way to do that without animation or particle effects or anything else. So I always look for excuses. Even in 3D games, I always try and place things at different distances from the camera, so there's something always moving when you're moving as a player. I mentioned readability earlier. I want to mention it again because if you don't do anything else in your visual style, make it readable, because it also will help the game be playable. I picked one of my games for this one that's noisy. So this is that, and this was only a 2-week game jam. So, keep that in mind with the visual fidelity. This game was set in this like broken, low poly cyberpunk world. So it's kind of noisy, but it still has a pretty good readability. And one of the key tools you can use for evaluating a game's readability is look at your game in black and white, in grayscale. Most artists all know this, but value is a better way to control the eye than color. If your game reads well from a value scale, you can put almost any color on there and it will still work. If you start with color, you're doomed, especially because the human eye is terrible at understanding the difference between value and color when viewing them together. So what you usually strive for when it comes to value is you want your foreground objects darker and your distant objects lighter. There can be some turnarounds if you're in a dark cave or whatever, but that generally tends to be the way things go. And you can see even in this, the darkest objects are the character's gloves. And they're always dark. I made sure they're always dark, even in lighting. And it helps provide a little bit of structure. That in the background's always lighter thanks to some anamorphic bloom and fog and whatnot. And you should always think in at least 3 planes, 2D or 3D, always think in 3D planes. So foreground, midground, and background. And the important notes about that is the foreground is the things that tend to stay attached to the camera. They tend to stop your eye from wandering off the picture plane. So as many framing devices as you can subtly or directly put in there, the better. The midground is usually your focal point. That's what the player is usually going to. And that's where you want to put the most detail. The background is just usually there to frame the world, right? So this game was about collecting energy. And these towers were designed in such a way visually so they would shoot this bright red light up. And anytime you were in this maze of a world, because it was procedurally generated, you could kind of look up and see these bright red lights and get some sense of where you're supposed to go. The other subtle thing that we did is I wanted this game to have this sort of like wireframe line edge shader. But rather than do it traditionally where people just put a wireframe and everything, I made the wireframe only respond or be modulated with light. So you can see that the wireframe on the objects in the foreground is rather dim and barely there, but the wireframe around the goal is quite strong. You have these very strong lights that creates value contrast and attracts your eye right where you want the player to go. That was just a choice I made for that shader that was somewhere along the lines of the style I wanted, but it really helped that. So color, people hate color. People love color, but hate working with color. Color is hard. I could spend a whole nother talk at least. I could spend a whole semester talking about color. And then one of the things that is tricky about color is it's very subjective. But my major piece of advice with color is, one, try and pick colors that don't confuse people. And the best way to do that is to just pick 3 colors for your game and stick to it. There are many things available on the internet that help you pick 3 color schemes for free. But pick 3. So I'm going to show you some of my crappy artwork. I'm not saying all my artwork's crappy. This is crappy. I ride the train a lot, and so I try to challenge myself to use my thumb on my trackpad to try and make something recognizable. And I got so frustrated, I was like, well, I'm just going to focus on color composition then. So these are just these little things that are very hard to control. But what I do is I pick 3 colors, and just using these sort of 3 colors, there's obviously some value in there too. It's like, can I make something that could be navigable by the player? Do these 3 colors, could I extend this to make a game? Here's another one, right? 3 different colors, but very simple. These are just simple shapes. You could even use clip art probably to do this if you wanted, just change the color. You always will get better results with limited color unless you are a master of color, which very few people are. If you look at Broken Age, which is an extremely colorful game, we wanted the boy's ship to be evocative of a child's playpen, so we had to incorporate some high saturation color, more color than we otherwise might. But if you look at the palette, most of this color, at least proportionally on screen, is just really these 3 colors, and there's like these small hot bits of accent. But they're hung in such a way that they don't over. It's still pretty clear where things are going. We use pattern as well, but still, 3 colors, stated 3 colors. You will not regret it, I promise you. I want to spend a few minutes again talking about telling the story. So we talked earlier about how visuals communicate the theme, and one of the things that when you're choosing a visual style, someone was asking earlier, like, what do I choose? Where do I go for reference? Try and choose something that you think tells a story. So if you're not familiar with art, maybe you're familiar with film, like what's a film that kind of tells a similar story? And I mean that just in broad thematic ways. So I want to talk about stacking a little bit and some of the ideas I had with stacking. So the mechanic in stacking is you take a small doll and you can stack into a larger doll and take control of that doll and get its abilities and use those dolls to solve puzzles. But thematically, the game is inspired by the Victorian era, and it's about social class and structures relating to that. And it turns out that in this world, the small dolls are the least powerful, and these giant dolls are always the captains of industry and in control of things. And you play the world's smallest doll, Charlie, who's one size smaller than everyone else. And so the other idea of the game is that, like, the smallest doll, the smallest person can make the biggest change in the world, right? And when you see other small dolls, like the children, they're put to work in the coal mines. I know this is sounding like a really charming game, but it is kind of funny. You ultimately solve puzzles by stacking together dolls and using their abilities together. That's how the mechanics work. But the thematic idea is only by working with dolls on a variety of class structures and together do you solve these puzzles and able to advance the game. And I carried that idea forward into the environment design. So you see things like this throughout the environment, these harmless looking train stools, but they come in different sizes that match the doll size. You'll notice that only the big dolls are sitting on the big train benches and the smaller dolls are on the small ones. And we spread this idea throughout the game everywhere, including the bathrooms, which is for comedic effect perhaps, but even the bathrooms have a hierarchy of sizes. And just that idea that we wanted to incorporate multiple sizes into the furniture and space design to support the theme is a really strange choice, but it led to a lot of unique set pieces and really helped us fill the world out in this kind of strange world. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to try and go through these pretty quickly. So I want to talk about a visual target. I'm going to go through this quickly, but a visual target is if you have the bandwidth and the interest, when you're trying to set yourself an idea for what your game will look like, I would say make a target early on. And a visual target is simply an image. Here's one I made for Headlander. My recommendation for visual target is make it in the type of, as close to the type of game that you're making as possible. So I made this one in 3D for a game that is largely 3D with a constrained side view camera. If I was working on Broken Age, I would make it in 2D. Try and stay close because, again, you don't want to chase concept art your whole time. You want to work with the same sort of presentation of your game. This is what my game camera kind of looks like, so this is how I'm going to make the key art. I'm not going to show a close-up of the character with some cool, like, composition, because that's not the game. So the other parts of this that I'll blaze through is just like, these are the components. I started off with a simple Maya render that highlights. I chose to simplify the composition because that was another idea in the game, was keeping these kind of flat compositions. I put a high pass filter on it, which is a way of flattening the shape. And I did that by only keeping the luminosity and getting rid of the saturation. So the saturation didn't get flattened, just luminosity. I blended them together. And that gives my game a little bit of a vintage feel, and it flattens the picture plane a little bit so that you don't play a 2.5D game the whole time going, wow, I wish it was 3D, because it's not going to be. I also found out early on that the power of color grading was really powerful, and I wanted to color grade the background and the midground different from each other. I could also do things like add texture overlays to add a little interest to it, and that is simply a 2D gradient texture that is blended with an overlay mode. I can do that because this game is a 2.5D game. If I was making a piece of concept art that wasn't similar to my game camera, it might not have occurred to me. And add some noise because it's old. And I wanted to do something interesting with bloom. A lot of games have bloom, but you notice that this bloom has some stripes in it. And that's because for me, a lot of the 70s graphic design used this horizontal stripe motif. And I wanted to incorporate that just in the way the lighting worked in the world and not plaster it on posters everywhere and be so obvious about it. And so this is what we wound up with in the game. This is a different scene, but these are all the same sort of ideas. Here's the basic render of that scene from the game. Here's what happens when we add the striped bloom, which amazing graphics programmers did for me. This is an implementation of real-time high-pass filter. I wound up with 3 layers of color grading that based on the Z depth from the camera that I could blend between. So here's the distant color grading, here's the mid color grading, here's a 4 color grading. And I could use these sort of semi-2D compositional tricks because I had a constrained camera. A little bit of noise. There's our texture overlay, very similar to what I did in Photoshop. It's square because hardware. And that is how the game looks. So I want to close real quickly. Do we have time for the videos?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, all right. I guess I won't show you guys any videos then. But well, it depends. Do you want to? All right, I'll show you one. I'll show you one. All right. So making a visual target is a 2D exercise. But when I went to develop Headlander, there were no programmers available, and I am not a programmer. I had a handful of artists. So in 3 weeks, we decided instead to make an in-game cutscene that would sell the game's ideas and styles and mechanic to see if we could kind of get interest. So it's another form of visual target. I'm going to show that to you now. But keep in mind, this was done quickly. No concept art ahead of time. We just were like, ah! And yes, so.
Ground control to Major Tom. Ground control to Major Tom. Take your protein pills and put your helmet on. Ground control to Major Tom. Commencing countdown, engines on. Check ignition and make our flight be with you.
So, yeah. I didn't tell people what the game was about, and they're like, what the hell? So, I was going to show you the Brutal Legend one, but we don't have time, so I'm going to skip it. But I will instead give you a summary. I'm happy to stay later and answer questions outside of class if you guys want. But real quickly, man, don't discount art direction. It can do a lot for your game. It will make your jobs easier even if you learn just a little bit about it. And when you talk about style, think about it. Give yourself a framework. You don't have to use mine. I just made it up. Use whatever you want, but just don't call it cartoony or stylized or hyperreal, because every artist will hate you. But actually, it's just not that useful to communicate in those terms. And when you create an art direction or a visual style, just start simple. Build it up. Work towards a visual target if you can, but at the very least, grab your reference, build some mood boards, give yourself some limitations, use 3 colors. And then lastly, I think the most important goal of visual style for me is to make it your own. Don't imitate your inspirations, be inspired by them, but make something that no one else has seen before, because that's why we're all doing this, right? And then lastly, just a little slide here, guys, for resources. If you want to learn a little bit more, a few things I recommend is look at Pixar Leica art books. I did talk about how you can't necessarily imitate their processes, but unlike video game art books, these aren't filled with marketing hyperbole usually. They actually show a lot of rough sketches, a lot of the process. They explain the thought behind. Up is a great example if you want to pick one. Here's another great book by an ex-production designer from Disney who goes through a lot of the thought process behind art direction, not so much the art side of it. Really good if you just want to think like an art director. If you want to know more about color, this is a great book. It's not a realistic painter book, despite what he says. Like, he's a realistic painter, but the principles in here are super useful, and it's very, very quick to get through. And then lastly, I posted the art direction document I created for Headlander at this link. Feel free to download it. This was an actual working ADD if you want to see what they tend to look like. And it goes through my 4 Fs, and it goes through the thought process I used and some of the early concepts. And it's all there. And lastly, if you would like to talk more, that's my email and Twitter. And there you go. So thank you, guys.